So welcome, and I just want to thank Sala and the city and all of you and my team for putting this together. You probably know we do this quite often, and we are absolutely thrilled to have them, to be able to host. So I would like to introduce our introducer. Is that not right? I can't say that? Okay, Angela.
Thank you. Hi, hey everyone. It's really awesome to be here in front of a crowd, and also to be in front of a crowd of like landscape architects and architects. It's different from my biology crew or my engineering crew, but I'm on my own journey. My name is Angela Daniluk. I'm a biologist at the City of Vancouver. I work in the sustainability group, and my practice focuses generally on adaptation to sea level rise in the past and current, heat sometimes, and biodiversity when they let me. Being out in Falls Creek at 10 p.m. at night in December when the tides are low with UBC students is quite a trip. The place is used 24/7. Many thanks to UBC Satellite Case, who is on the Sea2City team as an advisor. I'd also like to introduce members of the design team here tonight. So Natalie, Derek, Corey, and Christina here, thank you. And then also John and Jordan from EcoPlan, who are helping with the planning and delivery of the project in terms of engagement. I would like to just pause for a second and to say that we are here today gathered on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And it is quite a privilege to be here and to be on these lands and doing this work. The shoreline is an amazing place, it's a special place, and we are working in collaboration with Corey, with Charlene Alec, who is the Tsleil-Waututh knowledge keeper on this project, as well as representatives from Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam. And I've learned so much, and decolonization is a big part of this project, and it might not come out as much as it should tonight because we're tight on time, but this project is not just about figuring out what to do about sea level rise. It's about how to be in good relation with each other, how to decolonize our colonial practices as a city, and as our own individual practitioners' mindset. So, thank you. And also, I wanted to give a big shout out to the DES, to the second year design students who brought their fabulous designs. They were at the corner pocket upstairs, and their instructor, Arthur, saw Sea2City online and was like, hey, let's do a studio. So that was a really wonderful surprise, and we just connected about a month ago. So they did that work in the fall, and really encourage you to, if there is time to go back up and look, and just, wow, students are a lot smarter than I was. So I'm just gonna go through a little bit of context setting about what is the challenge. And really that someone born today is bound to expect or experience 50 centimeters of sea level rise by the time that they're 30, so around 2050. And then another meter or so by the time they're 80, so around 2100. So the decisions we make today on the landscape and infrastructure really will be impacted by this curve. And the light blue curve, that's the, I can't really swear in front of the crowd, but that's the old darn it curve. That, we are learning more and more about sea level rise and the systems that affect it. And so we have a lot of uncertainty to deal with. And so just keep that in mind as we're going through the show. So this is a map of Vancouver. In 2012, we did, we worked with some coastal engineers to figure out where is there flood hazard along the city. So dark blue is what is vulnerable to a major storm today. And the combination of the dark blue and light blue is what's vulnerable in the future with 1 meter sea level rise. And so you can see the footprint of that floodplain all around here. So the focus of the project today is in False Creek. And here it is zoomed in. So you can see that Granville Island, half of it is vulnerable today. And in the future, that vulnerability increases along the shoreline. We are working with Granville Island on this project, and that's a bit of a side hustle, because there's always time for that on this project. And so, it's been quite interesting to talk through their challenges. And just giving space to this, what False Creek was, what it looked like pre-contact. So these are images of False Creek and the shoreline before settlers came in and dramatically destroyed a lot of the habitat, destroyed cultural spaces, and filled in about half of False Creek. So we have what I call, as a biologist, because then I laugh because I've been called out on this, what does that mean? They're rocks, Angela, it's not soft. But these are really nice soft edges. There's gradual slopes here, it's kind of cobbly. It supports, a range of seaweeds that then in turn attract other species. And these were fishing grounds. Sturgeon were here, oysters, clams. People gathered here quite regularly. And it's still an important place for the peoples of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Okay, this is always a fun slide. So here we are in Falls Creek in 1890. This is pre-filling in. And so here's Main Street, and this is the footprint of Falls Creek today. So here's a map. Here is that map on the current urban footprint. And then here's our floodplain. So it's not really surprising. A local artist, Laiwan, just Google her, she did a project on how water remembers and really focused on this map and worked in those themes around ecology, but how water tends to remember where it was and will go back to that memory. So what are we doing about it? I get this question a lot. Vancouver figured out that it had a sea level rise problem in about 2012. We did an adaptation strategy then, using the best science, and figured out that climate or coastal hazard and flood risk is our biggest climate risk. And so we did a whole bunch of technical work, and then in 2018 we took that work into the public sphere along the Fraser River. The Fraser River floodplain is Vancouver's most at-risk floodplain. And so we asked questions like, what do you value when it comes to this issue of flooding and adaptation approaches? We weren't there to find solutions, but we were there to test approaches so we could build a toolbox of design criteria and planning principles. And so we did that work again in Falls Creek and asked similar questions to confirm values and principles. And so this work was really the groundwork for Sea2City. Quite often, as a lot of you know, coastal adaptation, people like me, we don't get involved in those conversations, or we haven't been. A lot of the dominant form along the shoreline in British Columbia are hard infrastructures, big trapezoidal earth-berm dikes or flood walls. And so Sea2City is answering the question of what else is out there in terms of coastal adaptation solutions. And that's what we're doing with PWL and MVRDV and Methuen+1. So the Sea2City Challenge, it kicked off in September. It will end in July. There's so much more to do. And it's really there to create a guideline for us at the city to make decisions with. These are not design builds. We're not coming out with that. We're working on first establishing a foundation of shared understanding with ourselves and partners, and also doing some learning. So PWL and MVRDV are looking at these sites. So between bridges, as we call it, Coors Park, and then Methuen+1 are looking at Olympic Village and Stamps Landing. Fun fact, Olympic Village was designed in 2007, 2008. We found out about sea level rise in 2012. So Indigenous Perspectives. It is a big part of the project, and it's something that we've worked with representatives from the nations on. So we have these tools, these guidelines, and the design teams, along with Corey and Charlene, are working together to figure out how do we decolonize language, which you'll see some great examples of, and how do we integrate Indigenous knowledge in a way that is respectful and builds, again, a foundation to build good relations. Look at all these people. That's Corey. We did a workshop yesterday to test some of these early ideas and interrogate our assumptions. And we are really learning. So we're here in round 2, and then we'll cruise on to round 3 with final concepts and a charrette. And that's the intro. Right, now it's like costume change. Hi, I'm Angela Daniluk. So this is Methuen+1's presentation, and Methuen really wanted to be here tonight, and I know a lot of you were here to see them, but they had an unexpected family emergency and had to go back to Seattle. So they say hello and that they wish to come back. They'll be back, and that we hope to show them off when they come back. So so these are the teams on Methuen+1. And here we are again. We got to take, so here's Corey, who's in the front row, and this is Charlene Alec, wonderful knowledge keeper, and we went on a boat around the harbor and up to Stanley Park to learn about each other, but also to learn about the land. And so Mithune's really taking this two-eyed seeing approach. So they're looking at, using Western science to, do research, but also Indigenous perspectives to guide the vision of the work. And they've been really thinking about how can they soften the edges? How can they look at ecologies that were once here, that could be here, that serve us in so many ways, and bring them back to False Creek? And so here we get this lovely view of, it's kind of like their mood board of muddy ecologies, eelgrass and rocky intertidal systems, these soft edges, and the promise that they could bring to False Creek. And so in adaptation, we tend to use these three concepts to define the dominant type of adaptation approaches we take as a practitioner. So resist, keep the water out. You think about the dikes that we might see around the Lower Mainland. Accommodate, understand your risk and let the water in, where you can tolerate it. Move and avoid, get away. And so this conversation, that was really, it was Corey's work, and he'll jump in whenever he wants to. But with Corey and Charlene, is that, take a look at that language really divorces us from the water. It others the water, and it puts us in that position of authority. When really, that's not probably the way we should be doing it. We should be in relation with the water. And so Mithune's answer to this, with Corey's assistance, was resist becomes acknowledge, accommodate becomes reciprocate, and move and avoid becomes repair. So language, it's important, right? Language forms concepts, and concepts forms positions, and positions form decisions. And so that's why we're getting to the root of some of these past issues. When you think about coastal adaptation, it's been mostly in the domain of very binary thinking, very engineered terminology, which solves for safety, and that's great. We continue to solve for safety, but there's so much more that we can do at shore. Okay, we're gonna cruise on to Olympic Village. Okay, so in Mithune's approach, these are their guiding principles. So learning from and with First Nations over time, increasing the diversity of the shoreline, respecting natural forces. Humans, we tend to think we're in control. My first job was environmental control officer. Can you imagine? I would come in, I was like, no, and I would not be wearing that silly uniform shirt that makes me look like a park ranger. I have a degree, thank you. It was actually great to not think about fashion in those days. Maintaining housing and breaking up the seawall. And then also practicing adapting. There's that tricky little bit of uncertainty. As humans, we tend to look at what's in front of us and we're like, oh, yeah, it's always been like that, right? It's gonna stay like that, right? Yeah. Wrong. You think about the history of False Creek, which I just showed you, 150 years, it's changed a lot. It's going to continue to change. It's something we can learn from nature. So these are some of the guiding ideas and inputs that are coming out with Mithune's work. So cedars, abundance, canoe culture, tide, experiencing the tide, the wave action along the water. And so, this is just going into all of their kind of the detailed stuff. I'm gonna kind of go through this, unless anything. No, okay. I like this one. So if you think about the current typology of the shoreline, if you hop on a False Creek ferry or an aqua bus, you can see it's very straight. It's very monoculture. So when you start to bring in this complexity, it really supports the subtidal ecosystem very well, and also attenuates wave action, which is very nice. Again, look at this. I always go through this, and I see the ducks. I salute the ducks that are eking it out here. I'm like, yeah, you're finding your way. This is so boring, and it doesn't feed you well. So imagine if you increase the slope of that shoreline, and you actually got to experience that tidal flat movement, the movement of the water on it, and then also imagine things coming back. Okay, housing. I don't have to tell this crowd that housing is a thing in the city of Vancouver. So Methune's thinking is that how can we transfer density over time to places that are less risky? And again, I just want to say that these are not decisions that the city of Vancouver has made. These are exploratory designs that we're using to explore things that we haven't considered. And it's really been a great tool. Yesterday, a lot of my colleagues are like, what? What? I'm like, yes, it's working. It's like that evil scheme. We've been scheming for years. Okay, so breaking up the seawall, we kind of talked about this, and just like these lovely typologies that aren't in our guidelines, anyone's guidelines in British Columbia. And I should say, like Sea2City, something like this design competition for sea level rise hasn't been done yet in Canada. They did something like this at the Lionsgate wastewater treatment facility, but we haven't seen this type of format for coastal adaptation. So Methune has broken up their work into pathways, because to deal with uncertainty, you need flexibility, you need options over time. And that was really neat, because quite often as an adaptation planner so far, we just say, yeah, okay, I'll take that one for 60 years, that one, maybe can do 100. Like, we just think in, like, again, siloed thinking with solutions. This, and you'll hear from PWL and MVRDB, the thought, the really innovation or aha moment for me was seeing how these designers move through time across adaptation approaches and make sure that one fit into the other, which is really like lovely to see and very ecological. There's no waste there. So you can just see that this then program could be designed to be, kitted out in certain ways. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna get to the main event. Okay, here we go. So here we have acknowledge, so resist. So what Methune has proposed is a cedar burn, woodland burn here to protect the assets behind it. And this is the original shoreline, I should point out. And then they've got this cool little flood control seat wall. And so you can see this is different because it's not a dike. In BC, we're like, okay, we'll just put a dike on it and call it safe. That presents problems because you can't put drainage through a dike. You have to pump it over, and then you have to pay for these really expensive pump stations that are loud and noisy. I grew up in Ladner, so I know what they're like. So this is really important to point out because you don't see a lot of cedars in the city of Vancouver. And cedars are the tree of life for the peoples from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. We don't put them up here as settlers. I guess we made that decision because they were too messy. Like, I've actually talked to some foresters who are like, if it doesn't look like a lollipop, I can't do it. And I'm like, what? I'm like, well, like, I like cedars, but people in the public realm, like, they don't like it. It's uncomfortable for people. And yet then you see everyone on Vancouver is heading up to the North Shore where it's full of cedars. So, like, take that, settler. Like, that's what I said. I was like, oh, that's a bit uncomfortable. Let's dig into that tension. So this is not just a flood control measure. This is incorporating Indigenous perspectives, increasing the vision, or sorry, the vision, or increasing the presence of Coast Salish peoples on the land. This is deliberate. This is revolutionary. This is a grove of trees. Okay, so now we move to reciprocate or accommodate. So this is like, okay, we're gonna let some of the water in, it's all gonna be fine. We see First Ave become a dike or a levee here. And then we see interventions at the building scale to protect critical infrastructure, and that might be in parkades, because we tend to have a lot of utilities in parkades. You still see now, okay, this berm is still in use. The seat wall probably still in use. But you can see here, these are like temporary or permanent flood control structures protecting assets underground. And here's an example of kind of what that can look like. Again, a lot of interventions include green plume infrastructure and what have you. And then we get to move to avoid. So here, and this is quite shocking, and I want to acknowledge this. Like, I'm kind of going through this, and I'm not like reacting because I've seen this stuff for a long time. But this is shocking, and again, I just want to say it's not a design build. I'm not going out tomorrow to the Olympic Village and tearing it down. But what if in 2100, because it is likely that sea level rise will get worse. What if we return this to a salt marsh? What if we included spaces for canoe culture? What if we had a cultural pavilion for peoples from the host nations to host? And we transfer density to these industrial lands. It's quite provocative. And so, interestingly, salt building, how many of us have been to Crash? Yes, I mean, it does the job, right? It now goes back to its history. It was always on piles. It's on piles today, so it goes back. There's some poetry there. And again, here's the berm. The berm becomes an island, which we can get to by either ferry or canoe power, and then there's these paths. And here's some examples of what this could look like. Okay, and again, this is their rendering here, showing what resist could look like, what reciprocate could look like. You start to see the edges kind of, change, and then what move or avoid could look like, repair. Okay, Stamps Landing. So we're cruising on. We're getting on to False Creek Ferry or an aqua bus, whichever you choose. I'm not going to judge. They're both lovely, lovely people. Always telling you what the weather's doing or who's doing what bad things in the False Creek. And we're going to Stamps, or it's quite a lovely 15-minute walk. So here with Stamps Landing, it's a bit different. Here the flood, and this is just showing where the flood paths are. It's more diffuse than, say, Olympic Village. And you can see also, what's unique about this site is that there's these historic streams that were once there that are now very buried that also enter into the project site. So that's a unique feature. And again, Bethune is presenting this adaptation pathway where everything kind of nests together over time. And so here we're at acknowledge or resist. So it's pretty simple. There's not a lot of change to the built form or the public realm. We have this seat wall that's along here to provide protection against floodwaters that may come in December, January, and February. I should also say, so Stamps, Cooper's Park, which we'll get to, and Olympic Village, they don't get wave action. So Between Bridges, which is the first site that is most closest to English Bay, that experiences about 30 to 50 centimeters extra of water, so of wave action. And so that's a very specific design consideration that we can take advantage of by not addressing, we don't have to address it, in this quiet part of the creek. And I got really excited about this. Like, can you imagine this type of structure in the public realm in False Creek, like in concert with the seawall? And it's so temporary, like it's so something that can move and offer different experiences along the water's edge. I really thought that was cool. Okay, so then we move to reciprocate or accommodate. The big key difference in this one is like, pop. Heather Civic Marina, which is a civic asset, has moved from this cove out here. And again, we're talking we'll get this about 2100. Anyways, and then we're talking about making this a salt marsh with paths for people to connect with water. One thing that the seawall does effectively right now, it separates us from the water. You cannot get to the water that fast unless you've had a couple too many at craft and you tumble over. And you shouldn't do that. Please don't do that. I've never done that, to be fair. But you see then we're starting to transfer the density here out of these spots, maybe based on the life cycle of the buildings, to somewhere that is safer. This is the levee here. And we've also got building scale interventions along the first floor. I like this too, not because I just love wetlands, but I do. But the city also has other goals. You know, we are looking to sequester carbon as part of our climate emergency mitigation target. And this wetlands, especially salt marshes, are really effective at sequestering carbon. So I think that's a quite exciting prospect. Okay, here's a fun little cross section that just shows where everything is going. And also, here's an example of we've done this. So that little cove being turned into a wetland, it's about the same scale as New Brighton. And so we've done this in Vancouver in collaboration with Sea2City and the port and the park board. Okay, repair, so move or avoiding. What does that look like? So we've seen, so here's the footprint of the site. We see a dramatic transfer of density to behind the levee, the dike. And we see the retention of this ribbon here, and I should say, oh, you guys will. This is like, another concept here was having this cultural ribbon along all of False Creek. So again, I'm gonna just share some of what you shared with us, Corey. Growing up in the West End, Corey's like, you know, I don't really see any expressions of my culture in these lands. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I think one of the, what kind of transferred this conversation was understanding that we are on unceded territory, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I've been a resident of the West End for over 18 years, and you know, I walk through the city and I'm a stranger, in my own territory. So I think this was probably one of the prominent propositions for this project, is to kind of realize that there's a greater opportunity here to bring culture to this project, and maybe not necessarily just permanent installations, or what would we call them, cultural identifiers, you know, like social jewelry. Yeah, social jewelry, yes, you know, totem poles and welcome figures, you know, looking beyond that. And I think both teams had definitely embraced this as part of the challenge. So, you know, being this provocative in the design, especially what you're seeing here with Methuen, really kind of resonates with, you know, bringing a broader kind of experience, culturally speaking, to the entire project. But yeah, I think that was probably what I wanted to.
Thank you. And so yeah, this is actually, part of that cultural expression that I alluded to before, and that this was Corey's input, is that having a canoe house for folks to gather and to do canoeing. And so yeah, here we're just going to take a trip through from this angle about the three ideas. So here we have resist. So you see we have the seat wall looking super sturdy and Heather Civic Marina. And then we start to see the movement of density, ground floor adaptations, and then this becoming a salt marsh with paths in there, the cultural ribbon really taking up space and getting robust. Moving the marina out, and then repair. So again, moving everyone out, having a few buildings here that probably serve recreation and cultural purposes. Designing with nature. And that's Methuen plus one. Thank you. And so next is, I'd like to welcome Derek and Christina to the floor.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having us here today. We're really happy to share some really initial ideas with you for the North Creek side, let's say. I'm Christina Knauf with MVRDB,
and I'm Derek Lee with PWO Partnership, together with Corey Douglas, who is also on our team. Just a bit of a shout out for those who aren't with us. We're also partnered with Del Terrace, also from Rotterdam. They are nature-based engineers as well as landscape architects. And you know, together I think this is been a really interesting team, and we're very excited to show what we have in this sort of interim phase of the project now. So maybe I can just go through this really quick. We're sort of at a midpoint of the process where, we've engaged with stakeholders, with the city, and really received input. We also have a core technical team as well, who are biologists, social scientists, Happy City. We have Gary Williams. We also have Modis, and we also have Westmore Advisors. So one of the most important things is we have these big ideas, but we also want to be able to test them with kind of local knowledge. So I wanted to provide a bit of a shout out to our team here locally as well. So, we're going to share our vision. One of the challenges about the north end of False Creek is that it's incredibly urbanized. It's a very tight gradient between the water's edge and the urban landscape, in contrast to the southern edge of the creek that Methuen 1 has presented. So we wanted to sort of go through this a little bit, and I'm going to pass it back over to Christina to kind of share our process a little bit more.
So we started by visiting the city, of course, trying to understand the place, meeting, of course, our collaborators, and also really walking around the sites to get a feeling for this place and to define some observations that we can also bring as outsiders, for example, to the city. So the first question is, of course, starting this project, how will sea level rise impact False Creek? How bad will it be? Probably, do we really have to be scared? Yes or no? So we started to look into what it actually means. How will the water rise? How far will the water line go? And how many people, businesses, homeowners will be affected? So you see here, similar to the maps that Angela showed earlier, you will go back to a sort of a historic map in a way of the city. And we're trying to understand how can we adapt this sort of zone along the water, while also improving the city, actually, improving the city's relationship with the water, and going back to how First Nations used to interact with nature, with the environment, and also in a way correcting maybe what went wrong the last couple of decades in our understanding of our relationship with the environment. So one of the first conclusions is it's not only about sea level rise. We also have to take into account precipitation and runoff water from the city. So we cannot just look at False Creek as a line, but we have to look at False Creek as part of an urban and natural system, and also think about how we can actually reconnect the waterfront with the city in order to reduce the flood risk. So we started thinking how can we change the conversation about sea level rise and flooding in the city? How can we actually turn it into a way of a dialogue that we have with all of us together, and think about this challenge of adaptation as a positive thing, as a sort of an opportunity to really define the future of Vancouver in a positive way, and design an optimistic future for the city together. And you could argue, yes, we will lose green spaces, we will lose the bike lanes that are there now, but we can anticipate that if we start planning now, if we start thinking about adaptation, we have a lot of time to adapt the city and to maybe even create a new central park in the city for the citizens and for everybody to enjoy this place. So with this, I would like to introduce some of our first ideas on how this place could develop. And as I said, it could become a driver for a sustainable future of the city. So using the maps, I think we all like these ones. You see the historic outlines, almost identical with the flood maps. So how can we not even just go back to how things were before, but learn from how they were and look into the future, maybe having to deal with even a little bit more blue than you see here on this map, because it's uncertain what's going to happen. So we believe that this area around False Creek could become a new sort of deeper waterfront for the city, and more like a zone rather than just a line, just the sea wall, but really like a green sort of ribbon that is flexible, that is shifting, and that it creates sort of a breathing space and a breathing edge of the city, and in a way an interaction zone with the water, where you could imagine landscapes like these ones that are much more natural, nature-based, also where you can imagine people again using the water in a different way, and also of course where you have to think about how to transform structures and how to maybe add more adaptable structures to this new sort of zone along the city's edge. So our vision for 2100 is this, right now still a little bit crazy, but we try to respond to the community values with ambitions, adding like, okay, yes, we have to think about people and homes, we have to think about mobility in the future, but what is our ambition for it? So we translated the community values into ambitions. For example, this place should become an inclusive and diverse space of belonging, or it should become a place of ecological kinship, or a place of new innovation and circularity, where things can be tested, where things don't have to be always permanent, but you could have some experimental spaces here, maybe also opportunities for local businesses to innovate together with the people. So you could argue that this zone could become sort of a very active place for the city, an inclusive space where the future of the city is invented, looking back at the past. And this informs then the first ideas for the sites, where we looked at between bridges and at Cooper's Park. So I will not keep talking too much and give it back to Philip.
Thank you. So how do we get there? We thought about this a lot, and this idea of resist, accommodate, and move was something that we were first asked about in terms of saying, okay, you need to put together 2 or 3 separate scenarios, almost siloed in each of these. And interestingly enough, both of our teams independently came to the same conclusion, which was, no, these are all interconnected. These are not 3 separate options or 3 separate scenarios. They're indeed interconnected. One leads into the other. The big question is when and how. And it's a bit of a choose your own adventure, because we don't choose, actually. It chooses for us. So we have to be able to adapt, and we have to be able to get to first stage and then assess what the rates of sea level rise are, what's going on in the world, and how do we then respond. So we got to get from here today to there, but we need to consider how we talk and think about sea level rise and the ways that we approach and prepare for the future. So in thinking about it, it's the language. Now, we can be pessimists and we can, react with fear, or we can be optimists and say, we live in a dynamic, condition on our planet, and we need to lead and be willing to shift our values and be having the courage to be able to find those creative solutions. We also have the time factor, which is unpredictable, right? Sea level rise could happen 1 meter within 50 years, or it might take 200 years. We don't know. So, from the traditional perspective, we tend to take this negative, reactive approach in terms of even our language. From resist, it quite often means stay back, build walls, build barriers, resist. From accommodate, it's the idea of go there. You must move, or you must adapt and respond or react. And from this language of retreat, which obviously is negative, and we have to get away and avoid and all of this. So we need to change our language, and we need to think about this language of reciprocity or relational adaptation. And so, let's think about how we can protect one another, or welcome what's happening in our world and those changing dynamics, and effectively playing host to those, embracing them, and then long-term moving together into a new future, an exciting future, an optimistic future, hopefully. So it's a process of gradual adaptation. It's phased, it's a concurrent approach, instead of the separate ideas, as I mentioned earlier. And it allows us to see adaptation as an ongoing process that is informed by a long-term future. And so this idea that we must be aspirational, we must be provocative, we must be setting our goals very, very high, because working backwards from that high point, we will be establishing some stepping stones. And it's better to be aspirational and say we're going to have some big leaps, in the interim, that are going to excite people, that are going to be innovative, that's going to, challenge us a bit more than just shining a light, a light down the road, and you can only see a few feet ahead at a time, and you don't really know where you're going. So we have to be aspirational. And to turn reactive planning into dynamic planning and make adaptation part of our culture with a long-term vision as part of this process, as mentioned. So in terms of this, it was interesting because Methuen has, had this sort of non-linear approach, depending on the different dynamic scenarios at hand, at each stage. So, that's really cool. And I think we've taken a similar approach, although this looks like more of a linear Gantt chart. One thing is that there are overlapping conditions from, our initial kind of, hosting and accommodating to sort of the long-term, changes that we have to make. So we have different adaptation pathways. We need different actions for tomorrow, for the midterm, and for the long term. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over, and we're going to walk through our different scenarios.
Yeah, also just adding to the timelines, we do understand that there is also in this process always moments when you have to check in and think, like, is this still going the right way? We have to, navigate a little bit in a different direction without losing this larger vision. So these are things that I think we're also learning from, the discussions we're having, how to bit by bit detail these timelines, how to understand, how to break it down to feasible pieces and tangible actions. So that's part of this process. Looking at Between Bridges, this is one of the most urban sites that this challenge contains. You see, of course, high-rise really close to the waterline. There's very little space for, adding major, small, large slopes or things like this. So that's quite a challenge for us when we want to look into more nature-based shorelines, for example. This is how the site looks today. Very hard vertical concrete decks along the water. They are not so, attractive for habitat, let's say. And also the buildings are, and the environments are not super welcoming, let's say, for all kinds of different people. So we looked at the current conditions, also analyzing a bit, what they are currently doing to the community values that the city defined earlier. And also, of course, going into the places and trying to understand what's actually happening, how does it feel, where might there be weak points, such as, for example, the parking entrances, and what is actually good and bad about the sites. You see here, for example, the place tries to attract people, but at the same time it doesn't, because the restaurants are not occupied, let's say. So the question is, how can Between Bridges contribute to this positive future and this vision that we have in mind? How can it add to positive adaptation of the city? So we started looking into the different steps, also in line with what is with which level of sea level rise, what is going to happen. First, probably the parking garages are going to get in trouble due to more pressure on the walls, due to quicker overtopping, more frequent overtopping of the walkways and the public decks. And so it would start, for example, pumping a lot more from the parking garages, and also start thinking about moving the utilities to higher levels, for example. And that starts to trigger already the need to think about new ways of making these places accessible in the future. Once the parking garages might be not usable anymore, how do you reach these places? Because the buildings are still, usable. So Derek is going to explain the next steps.
But before I do, one of the things that I think we talked a lot about is how do we not only build public awareness, but allow the public to embrace these new ideas. And quite often we talk in urban terms around quick starts, tactical urban interventions and such. And I think there's an opportunity, even in this interim phase, to think about an intervention, a resilient intervention that we've been talking about that could be immune to sea level rise. And that's the idea of recognizing that we have a waterfront seawall, which is an asset that's coveted worldwide. But if that's the problem, if that's the wall, the barrier, how can we make that more resilient and adaptable? So we thought that the idea of having a floating promenade, maybe with as an armature for marine ecology and archipelagos of planting and things that float on the water, as a means to kind of raise awareness and interest and intrigue into how we might creatively adapt to this particular challenge. So as we begin to move into 2050 to 2100, this is where we anticipate 1 meter in sea level rise, let's say, it's our assumption. A lot of times we think about the lifespan of buildings, and quite often we say, well, what was constructed, in this case, probably about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, realistically probably has a 50-year lifespan left before there has to be some serious decisions about whether we extend the lifespan of those buildings or we retire those buildings and relocate. But within that interim, though, we did see this opportunity to take more adaptive measures to buildings. So if you go to Seattle, for example, well, they raised their downtown by 1 story because that was in response to water pressure. Well, we could still do the same thing. We could move the ground floor to the 2nd floor. And in doing so, it gives us the agency to be relaxing that seawall a little bit and allowing it to breathe, allowing tidal inundation to happen. This is one of the only sites along Falls Creek that experiences a lot of wave action. And so the opportunity to maybe extend this floating promenade as either an inflatable barrier separate from this or maybe combined, but as that additional protection of the shoreline and changing people's experience about being able to touch the water, which hopefully by then will be a lot cleaner than it is today. So democratizing access to the water.
Yes, and you could start, thinking about once the ground floors have been lifted, can you connect them to higher levels to also give this breathing space to habitat, for example, creating a different experiences of people experiencing a more natural shoreline. And we can also imagine that bit by bit, for example, this floating structure along the foreshore could be activated, adding floating pavilions, for example, that could be maybe temporary, could be affordable to use for different smaller companies or for public and social users that would actually bring back people into this place that is now feeling a little bit exclusive maybe. You have the clicker?
Yeah, I do.
Thank you. So next steps would be even to just make the zone even more breathable, to extend it, to let the water in more and more as it needs to, because it's going to rise anyway. And I think these transformation steps can facilitate that rise. So around, let's say, towards 2100, we expect, in the best case, 1 meter of sea level rise. So by that time, also the buildings will have reached this critical moment of deciding, yes, to keep them or not. And some of them, we could decide to really transform those. As you can see here, the first row of buildings has been transformed. We keep the structure maybe, and that structure could offer also vertical space to host new types of living in there, maybe seasonal or temporary housing, affordable housing, but also creative spaces, for example. So we bit by bit populate this area in a more interactive way, making people able to use the shoreline in a more natural way. And you can
Before you Corey, I wanted you to maybe speak to some of our interventions from a cultural perspective.
Yeah, this one, I think between both teams it was extremely fun. I think they both posed, obviously both sites posed some really interesting challenges. Again, in this area, there's very little in the way of cultural expression. And we did a workshop, and I've been offering this workshop to the industry, talking about First Nations art and culture and architecture. And I think what maybe inspired a little bit of this, maybe, Derek, was the seasonal homes that we have. So for the First Nations community within Squamish Nation, at least, from what I'm understanding, is that we have seasonal homes. So these seasonal homes would be, for example, in Squamish, a winter home. And then our summer homes would be here in Vancouver. We have a fishing village as well. So, bringing something like that in this project was maybe part of the inspiration. Realizing that there's an opportunity for that level of cultural expression in the architecture in this area. Realizing that the foreshore was really a play host to our First Nations communities. That's where we fished, that's where we gathered, that's where we harvested. Really kind of inviting that relationship to the First Nations communities again. That was probably one of the prominent considerations, at least if I'm not incorrect here, was reinvigorating, reintroducing this relationship with First Nations communities to potentially be hosting in these areas was one of the inspirational moments as well.
And just very quickly on that, I just wanted to mention that one of the things that was really cool about our interactions with not only Corey, but our knowledge keeper, Charlene, she said something quite profound. She said that this used to be the grocery store of all the nations. There were few fishing villages or anything permanent in the False Creek Basin. This was one of the places, as she described, when the tide was low, the table was set. And so, thinking about this regenerative aspect of abundance, being able to go to the foreshore and collect mussels or clams or oysters and things, and being able to think, how can we create these armatures to embrace and to invite back what the water needs and what the land needs, and being able to repurpose a lot of these decommissioned buildings and foundations as armatures for a lot of that. So.
And then, of course, looking at the worst case, or maybe let's not call it the worst case, but looking even further ahead, do we have to let in more water? It doesn't matter, it can feed in, but we can also imagine to take this idea of transformation to another level, where we really, collaborate with indigenous knowledge keepers, with architects, and people that are interested in creating this relationship with the water. To transform even more buildings into indigenous-inspired architecture. So you can imagine this place could transform from this into something like this first ideas, but you see how much more interactive the space could become, how much more related to the water, and how much more flexible, for example. And some ideas of, yes, we can actually do this, we have done it already, and it's possible. This is a project of MBRD in Thailand and Taiwan, where we transformed an old shopping mall that was not usable anymore, but very loved by the community, into a public pool where people can meet still, and where there's smaller scale facilities for them to meet up and to get social support. Or a project in Seoul where we redesigned actually an existing highway and turned it into a high line. Also connecting it, and that's what Derek mentioned before, lifting the public level to the second floor and linking that to these walkways in order to create a new level of city in a way, a new urbanity that leaves space below for water to come in, for nature to come in. And also, of course, the landscapes can be transformed in a way that the water enters much more these areas.
Yeah, I think the idea of creating landscapes that can absorb water, can absorb energy, tidal energy, and so forth. And this is what we've been missing. The eelgrass beds and the marshes that characterize most of our shoreline, not only along Falls Creek Basin, but around our entire region. You know, it's more than just raising the grade. It's how do we allow that foreshore to be soft and to receive that. And this is actually part of our idea around a ribbon. And this is another part of our exercise, is creating a continuous ribbon around the creek. Well, what is a ribbon? Is it a dike? Is it a wall? Is it a line? Or is it a more permeable, environment? And I think that's where we are going with it, is it's more of a permeable environment rather than just a line. And so, there's no reason why we can't incorporate these places, not only to embrace natural ecology, but to strike harmony with people use, places for people. And, urban water storage. So, a lot of what we're talking about here is, sea level rise. But as you mentioned earlier, Christina, there's pluvial and fluvial events, storm events. How do we manage rainwater? How do we manage those peak flows and those more intensive events? And how do we begin to manage water? One of the key things that we did talk about in our group, and we did show in our slides, was this feature around our rights-of-ways, our streets, as storage devices for water, blue-green infrastructure. I bet you in 50 years, probably none of us will own a car. So how can we be repurposing that inland infrastructure that's going to also support resiliency along our foreshore? And then also, creating things that are temporary, that are seasonal, that are micro, and these quick starts that we talked about. Let's start this stuff tomorrow. Let's start building tomorrow. And we can do it without spending a lot, but capturing the imagination of our communities.
And you can see, just to underline, because people used to look at the Dutch people, how we protect ourselves from water, but actually we are also starting to look into different futures, futures where we do let water into our country, and we strategically look at which areas we want to protect and adapt, and which areas we really give water to. Just as a kind reminder that we are also learning, let's say. So the next slide, and I guess we have to be fast. Yeah, exactly. So Cooper's Park, so maybe I click through it. Okay. Yeah, and you sign. Okay, cool. So of course we looked again at the site, as I mentioned. We walked around a lot and tried to understand the place also according to the values that we learned from the city and the citizens, and looked into how it can transform. And actually the steps are relatively simple, but we might similar as the ones we presented before, but maybe the timelines are different. So you can also imagine that each of these different sites, also the ones on the phone that we presented today, they have their own specific conditions, and they might require different timelines in adaptation. So, for example, in this place, it's already a park. Maybe we can start letting in the water earlier because the buildings are set back a little bit. So here, maybe in the tomorrow steps, not so much changes, but in the midterm, we can already open up the waterfront, create different kinds of plantings, for example, that can actually deal with the different water levels in a better way, and where we can already start to introduce also these floating walkways that can be activated and that can really create this different interaction with the landscape and water. And then also here, we start to, in the next steps, once the water rises, we start to lift the activity to the second floor, connected to the existing city, and create more and more water storage and more habitat and livable spaces on a higher level for people as well. And of course, start to transform these buildings, as mentioned before. And we had in the workshop we had yesterday, a really nice idea to look also into urban agriculture, for example. Not just housing or the urban uses we know now. So you could just also imagine these become silos for urban food production, for example. So that's the next steps we will look into. I really like that idea. Actually, we don't know about it yet. So you also here you can imagine that Cooper's Park could transform from this current image into an image like this, for example. So, like we're starting to develop these ideas and also these atmospheres of the future positive park image that we could create in this area. So some examples from the Netherlands, where we start to also look into how to activate waterfronts, how to create opportunities for people to think in a new and an innovative way about using the water. For example, this is a floating office, a pavilion in Rotterdam, where also lectures are given, where educational programs are happening, and that also bring people to this area that are maybe not living there necessarily, but they do activate this place and they do transform it into a more inclusive space as well. And another example from the Netherlands is the Keuvel in Amsterdam. This is a circular project where people collected old houseboats. So maybe it's an answer to Mithun's moving of the marina. And they repurposed these houseboats into, social active spaces, and they connected them over the water and created a little small-scale circular economy space that also welcomes people to have coffees or debates and things like this. And of course, we can also look into making the space more usable for leisure. For leisure, creating small floating pavilions, for example, and also making the landscapes that are flooded more active. I give the last words to Derek.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, some really interesting ideas about how we can reconnect people to water. We talked about food, we talked about this abundance of this bounty that the marine environment offers us if we are willing to work with the land and the water. And this, I think, is our last slide. But, it does show an alternative future for False Creek. I grew up in Vancouver, and I remember, 40 years ago, not even, if you fell into the creek, they'd rush you to the hospital. And then when we were working on Southeast False Creek, the herring came back to spawn for the first time in 125 years, followed by a gray whale. So clearly, the ecosystem of False Creek is improving, the water quality is improving. We just have to get those boats out and stop them from dumping effluent in the water. But this could be our future. And I think that we hope that we can learn a lot through this process, through this design challenge, and from you all, because we're going to open it up now for a conversation, and we hope that we can even glean even more insight. Thank you very much.
Putting it in the right place. So we have time for about 2 questions, if anyone wants two questions. Well, yes, sir.
Given that kind of having a sense of vernacular is pretty essential to having a sort of a culture of place, which I think is really essential in adapting to approaching sea level. I'm curious, what kind of considerations you all are making to maintain a sense of place and avoid kind of the visual sameness of extremely modernist architecture, and also focusing on materials that are of the place as well.
Yeah, really nice question. We talked a lot about diversity. Diversity in people and voices, but also diversity in, for example, colors, or in materials, and we also I have to say I perceive this place a little bit like a monofunctional wall along the water. To be honest, no offense. So the idea is also to diversify this place through little measures. To these temporary pavilions, for example, to also different types of plants. In order to use what we have, but also transform it slowly into a much more rich place, and rich not as in money, but in rich in people, rich in different people, rich in different species, and rich in different experiences and spaces. So we're starting to work towards how could it really look like, and I think I'm really looking forward to those steps actually with the team.
Okay, great. wonderful presentations. Thank you very, very much for traveling so far. It's a name. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening.